My sister dumped her kids. I raised them. Now she wants them back, but I did this. Hello, read it. Some people are born with a sense of responsibility ingrained in them, an internal voice that tells them to do the right thing even when no one is watching. Others, like my sister, Leah, are born with the opposite. She had always been reckless, selfish, and completely incapable of thinking about anything beyond the immediate moment. It wasn't a flaw she developed over time. No, she had always been like that from the moment we were kids, and for some reason no one ever expected her to change. I was 3 years older than Leah, which meant from the moment she was born, I was forced into the role of her keeper. Our parents never framed it that way, of course, but looking back, it's obvious now. While she ran wild, I was expected to be the steady one, the responsible one, the one who didn't cause problems. If she broke something, I was the one scolded for not stopping her. If she forgot her homework, I was the one sent back home to fetch it. If she threw a tantrum in public, I was the one who had to apologize to the strangers she had disturbed. At first, I didn't question it. That was just the way things were. I was the older brother, the reliable one, the problem solver, and Leah was, well, Leah. While I spent my childhood following rules, making careful choices, and thinking ahead, she lived like life was one long, uninterrupted party where someone else always picked up the tab. And the worst part? She got away with it. Our parents adored Leah. Maybe it was because she was the youngest, or maybe because she had a way of making people bend to her will without them even realizing it. She was effortlessly charming when she wanted to be, flashing a wide, innocent smile whenever she needed someone on her side. Even when she screwed up, it was never her fault. It was always bad luck, or someone else's mistake, or the universe being unfair to her. And no matter how many times she burned them, our parents always forgave her. I was different. I had never been a troublemaker, never been someone who needed to be bailed out of bad situations. I had worked hard in school, gotten my first job at 16, saved money, planned my future with precision. I wasn't exceptional, but I was dependable, the kind of person who paid his bills on time and never made promises he couldn't keep. I thought that would be enough. I thought that, at some point, being responsible would count for something. But in my family, it never did. Even as we grew older, Leah remained the center of attention. She dropped out of college after one semester, claiming she was too creative for structured learning. She bounced from job to job, never lasting more than a few months before quitting because she was over it, or because someone had disrespected her. She lived on our parents' money without shame, treating their home like a free hotel that came with a built-in personal chef and laundry service. And still, they defended her. Still, they believed she would figure things out. I had moved out as soon as I could. By the time I was 22, I had my own small apartment, a steady job, and a quiet life that, while not exciting, was at least my own. I kept my distance from my family, not out of resentment, but because I had finally learned something important. Some people never change, and expecting them to will only lead to disappointment. Leah was always going to be Leah. There was no point in trying to convince her to be anything else. But just because I had moved on didn't mean she had. Over the years, Leah had a way of showing up when she needed something. A phone call here and there, always starting with fake excitement before casually slipping into whatever favor she needed. Hey, big brother, how's life? Listen, I have a tiny problem. The problem was never tiny. It was always money, help moving, a place to crash, an emergency that turned out to be nothing more than her own recklessness catching up with her. And every time, I told myself it would be the last time. But she had a way of wearing people down. The first time she asked me for money, she had just lost her job and was on the verge of homelessness. I sent her enough to cover rent for a month, thinking that would buy her time to figure things out. A few weeks later, I saw her posting vacation photos from Miami, a trip she had desperately needed for her mental health. The second time she called, she had totaled her car and needed help getting a new one. I refused, and she screamed at me, calling me selfish, telling me that family was supposed to help each other. That was Leah. She didn't just take. She demanded. She made you feel guilty for not bending to her will. And the worst part? It worked. Not on me, not anymore, but on our parents, on friends, on people who didn't know her well enough to see the pattern. No matter what she did, no matter how many times she proved that she was irresponsible, someone always came to her rescue. And as long as she had that safety net, she would never change. The last time I saw Leah before everything changed, she had come to visit me unexpectedly, showing up at my apartment with a fake smile and wide, innocent eyes. I knew what she wanted before she even opened her mouth. She was broke again. She needed a loan, just a little help, just until she got back on her feet. I refused immediately. This time, I didn't even entertain the idea. And she did what she always did. She turned ugly. The mask of sweetness vanished, and the insults came flying. She told me I was a heartless bastard, that I had always been jealous of her, that I was bitter because I had no life of my own. She told me I was cold, unlovable, that I would die alone because I didn't know how to take care of family. I didn't argue. I didn't yell back. I just stood there, watching her spiral, watching her try to break me down like she had done to so many others. And then, when she realized I wasn't going to cave, she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I thought that was the end of it. I thought that was the moment she would finally stop coming to me. I was wrong, because just a few months later, I got a text message from her, a short, vague demand that made my stomach sink the moment I read it. No explanation, no details. Just an address and 5 words. You need to go. Now. And in that moment, I knew Leah had done something worse than ever before. I just didn't know what. Yet, the text from Leah sat on my screen, glowing like a warning light in the darkness of my apartment. You need to go. Now. No hello, no explanation, not even a fake attempt at small talk. Just an order, blunt and urgent, as if she expected me to drop everything without question. It had been months since I'd last spoken to her, and after the way she left, I had assumed she wouldn't bother trying again. But here she was demanding my time, my attention, my presence, like nothing had happened. I knew better than to get involved. Leah's emergencies had never been real emergencies. They were inconveniences, self-inflicted problems disguised as catastrophes, always requiring someone else to swoop in and save her. But there was something about this message that felt different. There was no manipulation in it, no dramatic plea or half-baked sob story. Just urgency. I should have ignored it. I should have turned off my phone, poured myself a drink, and let Leah deal with whatever crisis she had created. But something in my gut told me this wasn't one of her usual schemes. I typed a reply, "What's going on?" and stared at the screen, waiting. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Appeared again, then nothing. That wasn't like her. Leah never hesitated when she wanted something. Frowning, I copied the address she had sent me and plugged it into my GPS. It wasn't her usual apartment. It wasn't even in the same neighborhood. Instead, it led to a run-down part of the city, somewhere I never would have imagined Leah spending time. She had always liked flashy, expensive places, even when she couldn't afford them. This was the opposite. I debated whether or not to go. I owed her nothing. But if there was even the slightest chance that this was serious, that something had really happened, if I ignored her and found out later that she had been in actual danger, I knew I wouldn't be able to live with that. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed my keys and left. The drive took longer than expected, mostly because I kept second-guessing myself at every red light. Why was I doing this? Why was I letting Leah drag me back into her mess? I reminded myself that I wasn't going for her. I was going for closure, for peace of mind, so that when I walked away this time, I could do it knowing I had truly given up on her. The neighborhood was even worse than I had expected. Crumbling buildings, dim streetlights flickering in and out, the kind of place where people avoided eye contact. My stomach twisted as I pulled up to the address Leah had sent me. A small, 2-story complex with peeling paint and a broken front gate. It didn't look like a place Leah would ever choose to live, which meant she was either hiding from something or she had fallen further than I realized. I parked and stepped out, my breath visible in the cold night air. The entrance door to the building was propped open with a brick, the kind of lazy security measure that screamed trouble. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart beat faster than I wanted to admit. Leah's apartment was on the 2nd floor, number 2B. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my pulse spike. I hesitated, listening. No voices. No movement. Just an eerie silence. I knocked once. Nothing. Pushing the door open, I braced myself for whatever disaster awaited me inside. And that was the moment my life changed forever. The apartment was nearly empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just the bare bones of a place someone had walked away from in a hurry. A faint smell of old cigarettes and cheap takeout lingered in the air. And in the middle of the room, sitting on the worn-out carpet, were 3 small children. They weren't scared. They weren't crying. They were just waiting. The oldest, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6, looked up at me with wide, serious eyes, clutching the hands of the 2 smaller ones beside her. A boy around 4 and a baby who couldn't have been older than 2. They were quiet, too quiet, the way kids get when they've already learned that no one is coming to help them. I took a slow, careful step forward, my mouth dry. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where's your mom?" The little girl blinked up at me, then said, in the steadiest voice I'd ever heard from a child, "She's gone." Something inside me cracked. Gone. The word echoed in my head, bouncing around like a cruel joke, a punchline I wasn't ready for. Leah wasn't just late. She wasn't hiding in the bathroom, waiting to make some grand entrance. She had left, and she had left them behind. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was abandonment. I crouched down, forcing my voice to stay calm, even though my heart was hammering. Did she say where she was going? The little girl, Emma, I later learned, shook her head. She said you'd come. That was the moment I realized Leah's text hadn't been a call for help. It had been a warning, a passing of responsibility. She hadn't been in trouble. She hadn't needed saving. She had made a choice. And in doing so, she had made one for me too. Because standing in that empty apartment, looking at those 3 small faces, I knew I couldn't walk away. It didn't matter what Leah had done. It didn't matter how many times she had hurt me, used me, or taken advantage of my kindness. These kids had nothing to do with that. They hadn't asked to be born into this chaos. They hadn't done anything to deserve being abandoned like this. And if I left, if I turned my back the way Leah had, then I would be no better than her. So I took a deep breath, and I made a decision. I wasn't leaving without them. The weight of the moment settled over me like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. Standing in that empty apartment, staring down at 3 small children who had no one left, there was no time to think, no space to process what had just happened. Leah was gone. That fact carved itself into my bones the second Emma looked up at me with those wide, serious eyes and said those words. She wasn't coming back. She had walked away from this life, from her own children, leaving behind nothing but silence and unanswered questions. The room smelled of neglect, stale air, forgotten meals, the faint trace of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls. There were no signs of struggle, no desperate attempt at packing, no last-minute hesitation in her decision. Leah hadn't left in a rush. She had planned this. That realization made my stomach twist. This wasn't a moment of panic or a last resort. She had made a conscious choice. And in doing so, she had forced one onto me. The children sat in the middle of the bare floor, unnervingly quiet. They weren't crying. They weren't asking questions. They were just waiting, as if they had already learned that expecting answers would only lead to disappointment. That thought made my throat tighten. How long had they been here? How many hours or days had they spent like this, sitting in an empty apartment, waiting for someone to come? Had Leah told them when she was leaving? Had she told them anything at all? The silence pressed against me, thick and unrelenting. My eyes scanned the space, looking for anything, some sign of what she had been thinking, something that would make sense of this. But there was nothing left behind. No clothes, no pictures, no trace of her existence beyond the 3 children sitting on the floor. The only proof that she had ever been here was the mess she had left in her wake, the consequences of her actions staring up at me with innocent, expectant faces. I took a slow breath and forced myself to move. The fridge was nearly empty, except for a few expired cartons of yogurt and an old bottle of ketchup. The pantry was worse. The only thing that wasn't running out was the silence. It pressed against my skull, wrapped itself around my ribs, made every breath feel like a conscious effort. I could have walked away. That thought hovered in the back of my mind, unspoken but insistent. I could have turned around, stepped out, pretended I never saw any of this. I could have called social services, let the system handle it, let someone else be responsible. No one would have blamed me. The kids weren't mine. They weren't my responsibility. Leah had done this. Leah had made this mess. It wasn't my job to clean it up, but it wasn't that simple. It never had been. I wasn't Leah. I wasn't someone who could just walk away, who could sever ties the moment things became difficult. I wasn't someone who could look into the eyes of 3 small children and leave them to fend for themselves. No one else was coming for them. No one else had received that text. Leah hadn't reached out to our parents. She hadn't reached out to friends. She had chosen me, not because she believed in me, not because she trusted me, but because she knew I would show up. She had gambled on my sense of responsibility. She had bet on the part of me that had always been forced to pick up the pieces of her mistakes. And the worst part? She had been right. Because despite everything, despite every bitter memory, every moment of resentment, every selfish decision she had made over the years, I couldn't walk away. Not from them. Not from the ones she had left behind. I had no experience raising kids. I had spent my entire life avoiding that level of responsibility, making careful choices to ensure I was never trapped by something I wasn't ready for. But none of that mattered now. Leah had taken that choice away from me. She had placed it in my hands without permission, forcing me to either accept it or abandon them the way she had. I forced myself to take another step into the apartment, feeling the finality of what I was about to do settle deep in my bones. Emma remained still, her eyes locked onto mine, watching me carefully. The other 2, Noah and Lily, leaned into her as if she was the only thing anchoring them to reality. They had learned, far too early, that they only had each other. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. They were so small, so alone. Leah had spent years making herself the center of attention, convincing everyone that she was the victim whenever things didn't go her way. She had used people like stepping stones, moving from one to the next the moment they no longer served her purpose. But these kids weren't stepping stones. They weren't burdens to be discarded at the first sign of inconvenience. They were people. They were innocent, and they had no one else. I thought about calling our parents, but the thought made me sick. They had spent their entire lives enabling Leah, making excuses for her, pretending her behavior was normal. They had been too blind to see the damage she left behind. And even if they were willing to take the kids, what kind of future would that give them? Would they be raised the way Leah had been, learning that selfishness was rewarded and consequences didn't exist? No, that wasn't an option. The weight of the decision settled onto my shoulders, pressing down hard, suffocating and undeniable. I had never asked for this. I had spent years distancing myself from the chaos, trying to carve out a life that wasn't dictated by Leah's mistakes. But now, here I was, standing in the wreckage of her latest disaster, holding the responsibility she had thrown away like garbage. It didn't matter what I wanted anymore. This wasn't about me. This was about them. This was about 3 children who had been abandoned, who had been left behind by the one person they had trusted most. And if I walked away, if I left them to figure it out on their own, then I would be no better than Leah. I took a slow breath, feeling the finality of the moment settle in my chest. My life had just changed forever, and there was no going back. The first few weeks after taking the kids in were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and relentless responsibility. I hadn't fully thought it through when I walked out of that empty apartment with them. There had been no plan, no moment of clarity, just instinct, a desperate need to make sure they weren't left alone. I didn't know what I was doing. I barely understood what I had just taken on. There was no time to process it, no space to sit down and let the weight of it sink in. I just moved, step after step, hour after hour, trying to keep everything from falling apart. The first night was brutal. My apartment wasn't meant for kids. There were no spare beds, no toys, no diapers for Lily, no clue how to handle a 4-year-old boy waking up screaming from a nightmare. Emma, somehow, had been the only one holding things together, stepping in with a quiet strength that made my chest ache. She shouldn't have had to. A 6-year-old shouldn't have had to be the adult. But she was, because she had no choice. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. There was always something to do. Noah spilling his food, Lily crying at random hours, Emma trying to help but never asking for help herself. I wasn't prepared for the constant messes, the tantrums, the endless exhaustion of being needed at every second of the day. Every time I sat down, someone needed something. Every time I thought I'd figured something out, something else went wrong. I had never felt more lost. Money became a problem almost immediately. My salary had always been enough for me. Enough to live comfortably, to afford a decent apartment, to enjoy small luxuries without worrying too much about my bank account. But now, I was supporting 3 extra people, and kids were expensive in ways I had never considered before. Diapers, formula, food, clothes, daycare. I burned through my savings faster than I could keep up. The first time I stood in the grocery store, staring at a cart full of things I had never needed before, I felt the reality of my situation crash down on me like a weight I couldn't carry. And then there was the legal side of it. Leah hadn't left behind any paperwork, no official custody transfer, no way to prove that I had the right to take care of them. I wasn't their father. I wasn't even their legal guardian. I was just the only one who had shown up. If someone questioned it, if child services got involved, there was no guarantee they would let me keep them. And the thought of losing them, especially now after everything, made me physically sick. My parents called once. Just once. Not to ask about the kids, not to see if I was okay, but to ask why I hadn't just contacted social services. They didn't understand why I had inserted myself into the situation, why I had taken on something that wasn't my responsibility. They spoke about it like it was a minor inconvenience, something that could be solved with the right paperwork. Like these weren't their grandchildren. That was when I knew. I was completely alone in this. Leah wasn't coming back. My parents weren't going to help. No one else was stepping in. This was my life now, whether I had been ready for it or not. Months passed and somehow I adjusted. The exhaustion never left, but it became part of my routine. I stopped noticing how little sleep I got. I got used to eating quickly, to multitasking, to never having a moment to myself. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about when this would end. I stopped looking at it like Leah's mess that I was cleaning up. It became my life, and something changed in me. The first time Lily called me Dada, it hit me harder than anything ever had. She was barely talking, just learning words, and yet there it was, a title I had never expected, never asked for. A title that sent something sharp and unexpected through my chest. I wasn't her father. I had never planned to be. But in her eyes, I was the only one she had ever known. Emma started trusting me more. She started asking for things instead of silently waiting to see if I would notice what she needed. She stopped bracing for disappointment. She started laughing more. She started acting like a child again. And Noah, once so quiet and unsure, started following me everywhere. He would hover in the doorway when I cooked, sit next to me when I worked, crawl into my lap when he was tired. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but over time, I became their person. I had taken them in because I couldn't walk away. But at some point, without realizing it, I had stopped thinking of them as someone else's kids. They were mine. Not legally, not yet, but in every way that mattered. And then one evening, Leah came back. There was no warning, no gradual build-up, just a knock at the door, sharp, impatient, shattering the fragile peace I had spent months fighting for. I opened it, and there she was, smiling like nothing had happened. She looked different, but not in the way I had expected. She wasn't disheveled. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't broken. She looked fine, like someone who had been living an easy, comfortable life. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect, her clothes expensive. It made my stomach turn. While I had been drowning, barely scraping by, breaking myself every day to keep her kids safe, she had been out there living her best life. She stepped inside like she belonged, her eyes scanning the apartment like she was inspecting a rental property. No acknowledgement of how much had changed. No hesitation. And then she said the words that made my blood run cold. She wanted her kids back. Leah stood in my doorway like she had never left, like she hadn't vanished for months, like she hadn't abandoned her kids and left me to pick up the pieces. She looked comfortable, put together, perfectly at ease, as if she had just stepped out to grab coffee and was now returning to claim what was hers. The moment she said it, that she wanted her kids back, my entire body went cold. She hadn't even looked at them yet, hadn't asked how they were, hadn't acknowledged the months they had spent wondering where she was. Her voice had been casual, almost dismissive, as if she was talking about collecting lost luggage at an airport. I stood there, unmoving, my heart slamming against my ribs. 1,000 thoughts crashed into each other in my mind, but the loudest one was no. She didn't deserve them. She had left them. Not in a moment of crisis, not out of desperation. She had planned it. She had walked away without looking back, and now, just as suddenly, she had decided she wanted to waltz back into their lives and pretend nothing had happened. I finally stepped aside, not to invite her in, but so she could see them. Emma was the first one she noticed. She was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring like she always did in the evenings. When she looked up and saw Leah, she froze. Her grip tightened on the crayon, her small body tensing, her expression blank. Not excitement, not relief, just fear. Noah appeared next, stepping out from the bedroom, his favorite stuffed rabbit clutched in his hands. His eyes flickered between me and Leah, uncertain, hesitant, like a child caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. And then there was Lily. She had been sitting on the floor near my feet, playing with blocks, humming softly to herself. She hadn't even noticed Leah yet. But when she did, when she looked up at this stranger standing in the doorway, there was no recognition in her eyes. She didn't know who she was. Something inside me cracked. Leah's face faltered for the first time, a flicker of something crossing her expression. Annoyance, maybe, or frustration. Not regret, not guilt, just irritation that things weren't unfolding the way she had expected. She forced a smile and stepped forward, too fast, too eager. She tried to make her voice bright, cheerful, fake. "Hey, babies, Mommy's back." Emma flinched. Noah took a step back. "And Lily?" She turned, grabbed onto my pant leg, and hid behind me. That was it. That was all I needed to know. I took a breath, slow and steady, feeling something inside me lock into place. The months of exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the constant weight of responsibility, none of it mattered. I would do it all over again 100 times before I let her take them. Leah was saying something, still pretending, still trying to act like this was her home, her life, her family. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had spent my entire life cleaning up after her, fixing her mistakes, making sure her recklessness didn't destroy everything in its path. She had always known I would be there, always counted on the fact that someone, our parents, her friends, me would pick up the pieces when she fell apart. But this time, she wasn't getting them back. She wasn't getting anything back. She had thrown them away, and in doing so, she had thrown me away too. I didn't care what she wanted. I didn't care about her excuses, her justifications, her delusions that she could come back after all this time and pretend it never happened. She had already made her choice, and I had made mine. I met her gaze, my voice steady, unshakable. "No." She blinked. "What?" I didn't repeat myself. I didn't have to. I turned away from her, towards the kids, towards my kids. She wasn't their mother anymore, not in any way that mattered, and she never would be again. She started yelling then. I knew she would. The facade cracked, and underneath it, there was nothing but entitlement, nothing but rage that she wasn't getting her way. She threw accusations, called me names, told me I had no right, that I was stealing them from her. She said she would take me to court, said she would get a lawyer, that I had no legal claim to them. I already had a lawyer. I had started the process months ago. The moment I had realized she wasn't coming back, the moment I had accepted that this was my life now, I had started the paperwork. Custody, adoption, making it official. Because deep down, I had always known this day would come. And I had made sure that when it did, she wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I told her that. And for the first time since she had shown up, Leah looked afraid. She left in a rage, spitting threats, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow. I didn't watch her leave. I turned back to my kids. Emma had set her crayons down, her small hands clenched into fists in her lap. Noah was standing close to me, silent, waiting, and Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, was still clutching my leg, hiding from the woman who had given birth to her. I crouched down, took her into my arms, and she melted against me, small and warm in mine. Emma's voice was quiet, hesitant, but firm. "She's not coming back, right?" I met her gaze, and for the first time I could give her a real answer. No, she's not. And just like that, she exhaled. Not in relief, not in happiness, but in something close to peace. I had spent so much time trying to figure out if I had done the right thing, if stepping up had been a mistake, if I had been wrong to take them in when I had no idea what I was doing. But at that moment, as I held Lily close, as Emma finally unclenched her fists, as Noah leaned against my side, I knew the truth. I hadn't just saved them. It saved me too.